The year was 1879, and the world, it seemed, was made of red dust. Dry Creek, a town that lived up to its name more often than not, was choking on it. The wind, a hot and tireless thing, blew in from the plains, carrying the topsoil of 3 counties with it. It scoured the paint from the false-fronted buildings, whittled away at the wooden sidewalks, and settled in a fine, gritty layer on everything and everyone. It tasted of iron and distance. High above the single main street, a canvas sign for Burke's Bank fought a losing battle with the gusts. It flapped and snapped, a sound like a gunshot followed by the tearing of cloth, over and over again. The sign was one of the few new things in Dry Creek. Most of the town looked tired, worn down to the bone by sun and hardship. The livery smelled of old hay and horse sweat. The general store's windows were clouded with a permanent film of dust, and the doors of the Red Lantern Saloon swung open and shut on their own accord, pushed by the wind, spilling the sounds of a tinny piano and rough laughter into the street. Into this scene of weary noise and persistent dust, a man walked, leading his horse. He was a tall man, built not with the heavy muscle of a brawler, but the lean, corded strength of one who works from sun-up to sundown. His coat was a faded brown canvas, the elbows worn thin and the collar frayed. His hat was pulled low, casting a deep shadow over his face, but it couldn't hide the set of his jaw, a line that spoke of stubbornness and silence. His name was Colt Harrow. He moved through the town as if he were a part of the landscape, as immovable and quiet as the sun-bleached hills that surrounded them. People saw him, of course. A woman sweeping the porch of the boarding house paused, her broom still, her eyes following him. 2 old men whittling on a bench by the blacksmith's shop fell silent, their knives motionless in their hands. They watched him, their gazes a mixture of pity and respect. Colt Harrow didn't invite conversation. His eyes, when you could catch a glimpse of them, were like lamps turned down low, the flame burning steady but giving off little light to the outside world. He was the sole owner of the Harrow Ranch, a stretch of land that had been in his family for 2 generations, a place he worked alone since his folks had been taken by the fever 5 years back. The silence that followed him was heavy with unspoken words, with a rumor that clung to the air as thick as the dust. It was a rumor that had started in the Red Lantern, fueled by Silas Burke's whiskey and the loose tongues of his hired men. The rumor said that the Harrow Ranch was dying of thirst. The long drought had shrunk the creek to a muddy trickle, and Colt's well, the one his father had dug by hand, was running low. And Silas Burke, the man whose new sign flapped so arrogantly over the town, was said to be just days away from foreclosing on the water rights. Burke, it was whispered, didn't want the land so much as the water beneath it. In a place like Dry Creek, water was more than life. It was power, and Burke was a man who collected power. Colt didn't acknowledge the stares or the silence. His focus was on the steady rhythm of his boots on the dusty street and the feel of the reins in his hand. His horse, a tough buckskin with intelligent eyes, walked patiently beside him, its head low against the wind. They were headed for the general store, for flour and salt and coffee, the simple necessities that marked the passage of another hard week. Just as he was about to tie the buckskin to the hitching post, the weekly stagecoach thundered into town, a great, lurching beast of wood and leather, pulled by 4 tired horses. It came to a groaning halt in the middle of the street, the driver cursing the dust and the heat in a low, practiced monotone. The arrival of the stage was one of the few events that could stir Dry Creek from its torpor. The saloon doors swung open for real this time, and a few curious faces peered out. The stage door opened, and a passenger descended. It wasn't a dusty prospector or a slick drummer selling patent medicines. It was a woman, traveling alone. She moved with a purpose that seemed at odds with the hesitant way she placed her boots on the unfamiliar ground. Her dress was practical, a dark blue poplin made for travel, but it was clean, a stark contrast to the red-brown hue of the town. She had a small box with a brass handle in one hand and was directing the driver as he unloaded a larger, heavier crate and a coil of thick wire from the roof. This was Lila Quinn. She was a telegraph operator, one of a new breed of wandering workers who followed the promise of the humming wires, connecting lonely towns to the wider world. Her equipment was her life: the battery box, the sounder, the key, and the endless spools of copper line. She had a contract to set up a temporary station in Dry Creek, a link for the railroad survey team that was pushing west. The driver, eager to be rid of his cargo and on his way to a drink, heaved the last crate onto the dusty ground with a thud. "That's the lot of it, miss," he grunted, wiping his brow with the back of a filthy glove. Lila surveyed her worldly possessions, now sitting in the middle of the main street of a town that looked like the end of the world. She took a deep breath, and the grit settled on the back of her tongue. Just then, the freight wagon she'd hired to haul her things to the old church storeroom rumbled forward. The driver, a boy no older than 16, clucked to his mules, and the wagon lurched. There was a sharp, sickening crack, a sound like a giant bone snapping. The wagon tilted violently to one side, its rear wheel splintering and collapsing inward. The axle had broken. The wagon, with all of Lila's precious equipment, sagged into the dust, stranded and useless. The boy stared at the broken wheel, his face a mask of panic. A few onlookers chuckled. It was just another bit of misfortune, another piece of the daily struggle that defined life in Dry Creek. Lila closed her eyes for a brief second. She was alone. Her tools were in jeopardy, and she was in a place that felt more foreign than any she'd ever been. Before anyone else could move or offer a useless word of advice, Colt Harrow was there. He hadn't said a thing. He'd simply dropped the buckskin's reins the horse knew to stand and walked over to the crippled wagon. He knelt in the thick dust, his worn coat brushing the ground, and examined the damage. His movements were economical, without a single wasted gesture. He ran a hand over the splintered wood of the axle, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he stood up, looked around, and his eyes settled on a discarded piece of hardwood, a heavy plank lying near the blacksmith's forge. He walked over, picked it up, and returned to the wagon. From a leather pouch on his belt, he produced a small, sharp hatchet. With quick, precise blows, he began to shape the wood, carving a thick, sturdy wedge. The only sounds were the thwack of the hatchet and the endless sighing of the wind. Lila watched, mesmerized by his quiet competence. He wasn't doing it for show, or for thanks. He was doing it because a thing was broken and needed fixing. He worked the wedge under the broken axle, then found a smaller log to use as a lever. With a grunt of effort, he lifted the corner of the heavy wagon just enough to jam the wedge securely into place, creating a temporary splint that would hold the wheel steady enough to get it off the street. He stood up, his work done. He looked at Lila, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were gray, the color of a winter sky, and held a deep, settled weariness. He didn't smile. He just looked. Lila found her voice, though it came out as a ragged breath. "It's my first time," she started, then stopped, unsure of what she was even trying to say. "I've come to a place like this." Colt Harrow held her gaze for a moment longer. Then, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was an acknowledgement, an understanding. He turned, wiping the grease and dust from his hands onto the thighs of his denim trousers. His buckskin, bothered by a swirl of dust, let out a sharp snort and shook its head, the harness leather creaking, and that was it. Colt picked up his reins and continued on to the general store as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just saved a stranger from a small disaster. From the second-story balcony of the bank, another man had watched the entire scene unfold. Silas Burke was the opposite of Colt Harrow in every way, where Colt was lean and weathered. Burke was soft and thick about the middle. His suit was black wool, immaculate despite the dust. His hands, resting on the polished rail, were clean, his fingernails trimmed. He saw the world not from the street but from above it. He had watched Colt's silent efficiency with a flicker of annoyance. But it was the woman, the newcomer, who held his interest. She was something new, an unknown quantity, and in Silas Burke's world, anything new was something to be assessed for its potential use. A small, thin smile touched his lips, a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Newcomers," he murmured to himself, his voice a low purr that was swallowed by the wind. "They make for good sport." Down below, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind, which had been blowing relentlessly, suddenly died down. The flapping of the bank sign ceased. An unnatural stillness fell over Dry Creek. And then, from the small white church at the end of the street, the bell began to toll. It rang out 3 times, each strike hanging in the heavy, silent air. A deep and resonant sound that seemed to mark a turning point. The sky, which had been a harsh, cloudless blue, was changing. A strange, greenish-yellow tint was spreading from the western horizon, and the air grew thick, charged with a tension you could feel on your skin. A storm was coming, but this wasn't the promise of gentle, life-giving rain. This was the threat of something violent, something that could tear a town like Dry Creek apart. The 3 tolls of the church bell did not fade. They were swallowed by a profound and sudden silence. The wind, which had been a constant, abrasive presence, vanished completely. The canvas sign for Burke's Bank, which had been fighting for its life, went limp and hung motionless. In the middle of the street, the dust, which had been in a state of perpetual motion, began to settle in a slow, suffocating curtain. The air grew heavy, thick, and hot, pressing down with a physical weight. The sky in the west was no longer blue. It had turned a bruised, sickly shade of yellow-green, a color that promised violence. From her stranded position by the broken wagon, Lila Quinn felt a primal fear she had never known. It was a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. She had faced city thugs, dishonest freight agents, and the patronizing dismissal of men who thought the telegraph was no place for a woman. But this was different. This was the land itself turning hostile, the very air becoming a threat. The boy who had been driving her wagon looked at the sky, his mouth agape, his face pale beneath its layer of grime. "Twister," he whispered, the word a small, terrified puff of air. Inside the general store, Colt Harrow had just finished paying for his supplies. He didn't need to look at the sky. He could feel the change in pressure in his bones, could smell the ozone and damp earth in the unnaturally still air. He had seen skies like this before. He knew what came next. The storekeeper, a balding man named Peters, was hastily trying to bar his windows. "Best stay put, Colt," he advised, his hands fumbling with a heavy wooden beam. "She's gonna be a bad one." Colt didn't answer. He slung the sack of flour over his shoulder, grabbed the bag with the rest of his provisions, and walked out the door. His first instinct was for his horse, to get it to the relative safety of the livery stable. But his gaze went past the buckskin, down the street to where the woman and her crippled wagon sat, exposed and vulnerable. He saw her looking at the sky, her posture rigid with fear. He saw the boy driver take one more look at the approaching wall of darkness and then bolt, running for the nearest shelter and leaving her completely alone. And then the wind came back. It didn't rise gradually. It hit Dry Creek like a physical blow, a solid wall of air and dust that exploded through the town. The silence was shattered by a deafening roar, a sound like 1,000 freight trains bearing down on them at once. The world dissolved. Visibility dropped to near zero. The street consumed by a churning, opaque cloud of red dust and debris, small pebbles, ripped from the ground, became stinging projectiles. A loose shutter was torn from its hinges and went cartwheeling through the air. The newly settled dust was whipped back into a frenzy, thicker and more suffocating than before. Lila threw an arm over her face, trying to shield her eyes and mouth from the abrasive blast. The force of the wind shoved her back against the wagon. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her equipment, her entire livelihood, was about to be destroyed by this malevolent storm. The church, the priest had offered her the old storeroom, a small, sturdy stone building behind the main sanctuary. It was her only hope. She grabbed the reins of the mules, screaming at them to move, her words instantly torn away and lost in the howl of the wind. The mules, terrified, balked and pulled against each other. The wagon, balanced precariously on Colt's temporary wedge, scraped and groaned forward a few feet. Lila pulled with all her might, her knuckles white, her body straining against the storm. They needed to cross Cedar Bridge, a rickety wooden structure that spanned the dry, rock-strewn arroyo at the edge of town. It was the only way to the church grounds. From his vantage point, Colt saw her desperate struggle. He saw the wagon begin its slow, doomed journey toward the bridge. Cursing under his breath, he dropped his supplies on the boardwalk, a week's worth of food and work forgotten. He untied the buckskin and swung into the saddle in one fluid motion. Leaning low over the horse's neck, he urged it forward, into the teeth of the storm. Riding through the twister was like navigating a nightmare. The air was so thick with dust he could barely see his horse's ears. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from the saddle. He navigated by instinct, by a memory of the town's layout burned into his mind. He caught up to the wagon just as its front wheels touched the first planks of the bridge. The bridge itself was a terrifying sight. The wooden structure, old and poorly maintained, was shaking violently, its timbers groaning and popping under the strain. The wind, funneled by the arroyo, was even stronger here. It slammed into the side of the wagon, which had a large canvas cover, turning it into a sail. The wagon tilted, the two wheels on the upwind side lifting clear off the planks. Lila screamed, a sound of pure terror that was barely audible over the storm. She was thrown against the side of the wagon bed, her hands scrambling for a hold. The mules panicked, their eyes wide with fear, and tried to back away, their hooves slipping on the shaking planks. The situation went from dire to catastrophic in a heartbeat. A heavy coil of new copper telegraph wire, which had been tied down in the back, broke from its mooring. It rolled to the edge of the wagon bed, and the wind caught the loose end, whipping it outward. The heavy wire unspooled with incredible speed, a glistening copper snake lashing through the air. It wrapped itself around the spokes of the broken, tilted wheel, pulling tight, tangling into an inextricable knot. The wire now acted as an anchor, pulling the wagon inexorably toward the edge of the bridge and the rocky chasm below. Colt didn't hesitate. He spurred the buckskin forward, forcing it onto the trembling bridge. The horse whinnied in protest but obeyed. He rode up alongside the teetering wagon and, in a move of desperate athleticism, launched himself from the saddle, landing squarely in the wagon bed. The impact sent a shudder through the entire structure. The bridge moaned, a long, drawn-out sound like a wounded beast in its death throes. He landed on his feet, his body braced against the lurching of the wagon. His eyes, narrowed against the stinging sand, took in the situation in a single, sweeping glance: the terrified woman, the tangled wire, the splintering wood of the bridge railing just inches away. He pulled the heavy hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade was worn, sharpened so many times its shape had changed. A tool meant for work, not for fighting. He scrambled to the back of the wagon, the floor pitching beneath him like the deck of a ship in a typhoon. He began hacking at the thick bundle of copper wire. It was tough, resilient. His knife bit into it, but it was slow work. Each time he raised his arm for a blow, the wind fought him, trying to tear the knife from his grasp. Strands of copper snapped, but the main bundle held fast. The wagon lurched again, tilting further. Lila had pushed herself into a corner of the wagon bed, making herself as small as possible. The world had been reduced to a whirlwind of noise, motion, and blinding dust. She saw the silent man working with a furious, controlled desperation. He was a force of nature himself, a fixed point of purpose in the midst of chaos. Through the roaring of the wind, she could hear the wood of the bridge splintering, cracking, giving way. Death felt terrifyingly close. She could not stop the words. They were a small, human sound in the face of the storm's fury. A confession whispered to the man who was her only hope. "It's my first time," she breathed, the words almost a sob. "I'm scared." Colt heard her, above the scream of the wind and the groan of the dying bridge. Her small voice cut through. He didn't turn. He didn't offer a word of comfort. There was no time for words, but his action was its own reply. As he continued to saw at the wires, he shifted his body slightly, placing himself between her and the worst of the wind, his broad back taking the brunt of the sand-blasting gale. It was a small, almost unconscious gesture, but it was more comforting than any hollow promise could have been. He saw that his makeshift wedge on the axle was beginning to slip under the violent shaking. With his free hand, he reached for the heavy leather latigo strap that held his saddle on the buckskin. With 3 quick pulls, he unbuckled it and ripped the long, thick strap free. Dropping to his knees, he wrapped the strap around the broken axle and the wagon frame, using the leverage of his entire body to pull it brutally tight, cinching the buckle. It was another crude fix, meant to last only moments, but moments were all they had. A final, desperate hack with the knife, and the last strand of copper wire snapped. The tension released with a loud twang. The wagon was free, but it was still tilting, sliding toward the abyss. "Get up!" Colt's voice was a raw bark. The first words she had ever heard him speak. It was not a request. It was a command. He grabbed the reins from her nerveless fingers, shoving her toward the relative safety of the wagon's front. He vaulted over the seat, landing on the driver's board. He laid the leather of the reins hard across the backs of the mules. "Hiya!" The terrified animals surged forward. Finding purchase, the good wheel bit into the planks, and the broken wheel, now braced by the saddle strap, scraped and screeched as it was dragged along. The wagon straightened out, lurching back into the ruts of the track. They shot forward, a chaotic jumble of man, woman, and machine, racing for the solid ground on the far side. They made it. The front wheels hit the dirt of the creek bank just as a final, deafening crack echoed behind them. The section of the bridge they had just crossed gave way completely, collapsing into the arroyo in a shower of splintered wood and dust. They had escaped by seconds. Colt didn't slow down until he had pulled the wagon into the lee of the stone church storeroom, where the wind was lessened by the solid wall. He brought the trembling mules to a halt and sat for a moment, his chest heaving, his hands still gripping the reins. As quickly as it had arrived, the fury of the storm began to abate. The roar lessened to a howl, then a moan, and finally, just the steady, abrasive whisper of the wind. The dust began to settle again, revealing a world transformed. Everything was coated in a thick, uniform layer of red silt. The sky overhead was beginning to lighten. The immediate danger was over. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the ragged sound of their own breathing and the nervous stamping of the mules. Lila pushed herself up, her whole body aching. Her hair was matted with mud, and her face was a mask of grit. She tasted sand on her lips, mixed with the salt of sweat and tears. Colt swung down from the driver's seat. He stood for a moment, his back to her, looking out over the altered landscape. Then he turned. His face was caked with dust, and a small trickle of blood ran from a cut on his cheek where a piece of flying debris had struck him. But his eyes were calm. Lila found her footing on the ground, her legs unsteady. She looked at him, at the man who had twice, without a word, saved her from disaster. He had faced down the storm itself to help her. "Thank you," she said, her voice weak and hoarse. Colt Harrow looked at her, then at the broken bridge in the distance, and then back at her. He didn't speak. He simply raised one hand to the brim of his dusty hat, touched it in a brief, almost formal gesture, and then turned to walk back toward his patient horse, which had somehow found its own shelter and was waiting for him, a ghost-like figure in the settling dust. As Lila watched him go, her eyes were drawn to a movement in the distance, down along the now impassable creek bed. The dust was still clearing, but she could make out two figures. They weren't looking at the destroyed bridge or the damaged town. They were methodically pacing along the edge of the arroyo, near a line of widely spaced fence posts that marked a property line. One of them would hammer something into the ground, and the other would make a note in a book. Even from this distance, she could see the new wooden stakes they were driving into the earth. Stakes that were significantly closer to the fence posts, closer to Colt Harrow's land than the old, weathered stone markers they were replacing. The twister had been a terrifying act of nature, but as the dust settled, Lila had the sinking feeling that she had just witnessed the beginning of a much colder and far more deliberate kind of storm. The days that followed the twister were quiet, but it was a brittle, anxious kind of quiet. The people of Dry Creek swept the red dust from their homes and businesses, patched their roofs, and cleared the debris from the street. But the air remained thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was just beginning to unfold. Lila Quinn, with the help of the town's gentle, stoop-shouldered priest, Father Michael, managed to move her damaged equipment into the old church storeroom. The space was small and smelled of damp stone and old incense, but it was solid, a fortress against the elements. She set up her station with methodical care. The heavy battery box sat on a makeshift table of planks and crates. Her telegraph sounder, a beautiful instrument of polished brass and mahogany, took pride of place in the center. Its rhythmic clicking, as she tested the lines, became a new heartbeat for the town, a sound of connection in a place that had long felt isolated. On the cool stone wall, she hung her chart of Morse code, its neat grid of dots and dashes a stark contrast to the simple, hand-carved wooden crucifix that hung beside it. It was an odd pairing, the language of God and the language of man, hanging side by side in the half-light. While Lila wove her web of copper wire, connecting Dry Creek to the outside world, Colt Harrow was fighting a silent, desperate battle with the earth itself. The drought, which had plagued the territory for 2 relentless years, had tightened its grip. The creek that gave the town its name was now little more than a string of stagnant, muddy pools. Colt's well, the lifeblood of his ranch, was critically low. Each day, he would lower the bucket, and each day, it would come up lighter, the splash of water at the bottom sounding farther and farther away. He spent his daylight hours checking the irrigation ditches his father had dug, clearing them of debris from the storm, his shovel striking the baked, cracked soil with a hollow thud. The earth was as hard as iron. The grasses in his hayfields were stunted and brown, brittle to the touch. He moved with a grim, relentless economy of motion, his face a mask of concentration. But Lila, who sometimes watched him from the small window of her new office, could see the worry etched in the lines around his eyes and the tight set of his jaw. He was a man watching his legacy turn to dust before his very eyes. The official blow came on a Thursday. A boy delivered a crisp envelope to the Harrow Ranch. It wasn't sent by post. It was delivered by hand from Burke's bank. Colt took it with a grimy hand. His knuckles scraped raw from his work. Inside was a legal document, a notice of water rights adjustment. The paper was thick and expensive, covered in a dense block of text printed in a font so small it looked like a field of thorns. Colt didn't need to read every word. He understood the gist of it instantly. The document stated that following the recent geological disturbances, a fancy term for the twister that had conveniently destroyed the old bridge and rearranged the landscape, a new survey of the creek bed had been required. Based on this new survey, conducted by men in Silas Burke's employ, the boundary markers for water access had been officially moved. The new markers, The very stakes Lila had seen being hammered into the ground effectively cut Colt off from the deepest part of the aquifer that fed his well. The legal language was suffocating, a web of clauses and sub-clauses, but the message was as clear and brutal as a punch to the gut. The water that had belonged to the Harrow family for 50 years now belonged to Silas Burke. Colt didn't rage. He didn't curse. He simply folded the paper, his movements slow and deliberate, and tucked it into the pocket of his worn shirt. Then he went back to work, his shovel striking the hard-packed earth with a little more force than before. That same afternoon, a message clicked its way across the wires to Lila's sounder. It was from the Union Pacific Railroad. Their survey team was a week out, and they needed to finalize their plans for a telegraph line running parallel to the proposed tracks. They wanted to lease small parcels of land along the route to erect signal poles and repeater stations. The message included a map of the proposed line. Lila's heart gave a small leap as she traced it with her finger. The line ran straight through the northern edge of Dry Creek territory, cutting directly across a wide, flat expanse of the Harrow Ranch. The railroad was offering to pay a respectable annual fee for every pole placed on a landowner's property. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady money. It was hope. Later that day, she saw Colt riding into town. She met him near the livery stable, holding the telegram in her hand. The afternoon sun was hot, and the air was still. "Mr. Harrow," she began, her voice a little uncertain. He stopped, turning to face her. He didn't speak, but his gaze was questioning. "I received a message," she said, holding out the paper. "From the railroad. They want to lease land for their telegraph line. The route crosses your property. They're paying well." She paused, then pressed on, her words coming faster. "I know it's none of my business, but I heard people talk about the water. Maybe this could help. You could sell them hay for their work horses, too. It could be enough to settle any debts." Colt's eyes flickered down to the telegram in her hand, but he didn't take it. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on the distant, sun-bleached hills. A muscle worked in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "I'm not taking on any more debt." "It's not a loan," Lila insisted gently. "It's a lease. It's income." He looked at her then, and for a moment, the weariness in his eyes was so profound it made her want to look away. "It's all the same, Miss Quinn," he said. "It's another man's hook in my land. I'm not borrowing from anyone." He gave a curt nod, the conversation over as far as he was concerned, and led his horse into the livery. Lila was left standing in the dust, the hopeful telegram feeling like a useless piece of paper in her hand. She didn't understand his pride, a stubbornness that seemed bent on its own destruction. Her education continued that evening, needing a hot meal. She ventured into the dining room of the town's only hotel, a place that shared a wall and a good deal of its clientele with the Red Lantern Saloon. The noise from the saloon bled through the thin partition, boisterous laughter, the clink of glasses, and the boastful talk of men. She recognized the voices of Silas Burke's hired hands, the same men she'd seen planting the survey stakes. A big, heavy-set man named Pike, who had a trio of jagged scars across the back of one hand, was holding court. "Harrow's finished," Pike declared, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "The well's nearly dry. He's got Burke's paper in his pocket. It's just a matter of time till he crawls in and begs to sell." Another man laughed, a wheezing, unpleasant sound. "He's too proud to crawl. He'll just stand there and watch it all die. Makes no difference to us. The boss gets what he wants, one way or another." Lila tried to ignore them, focusing on her plate of beans and salted pork. But then she saw something that made her pause, her fork halfway to her mouth. The men had their boots kicked out from under the table. They were caked in mud. That in itself wasn't unusual in Dry Creek. But this mud was different. It wasn't the sandy, pale brown soil of the plains or the dark, rich earth from the creek bed. It was a deep, vibrant red. the color of rust or dried blood. It was a thick, clay-like mud that clung to their boots in heavy clods. She had seen that color before, on her journey into town. The stagecoach driver had pointed out the landmarks. To the east, several miles out, was an old clay pit. "Nothing but useless red clay out there," the driver had said. "Stains everything it touches. No good for farmin', no good for grazin'." Lila knew, from looking at the county map while planning her telegraph route, that the clay pit was located on a large, undeveloped parcel of land owned by one man, Silas Burke. Why would his men be tromping around in a useless clay pit in the middle of a drought? The question lodged itself in her mind, a small, sharp splinter of suspicion. A few nights later, under the thin light of a sliver moon, someone moved the boundary markers. It wasn't a dramatic act. It was a quiet, insidious one. The new wooden stakes that Burke's men had planted along the creek bed were dug up and moved again, this time by only a few feet. But a few feet that were crucial. They were moved even farther onto Harrow's property, encroaching on the last patch of land that still showed a hint of green. It was a slow, creeping theft, a stealing of land by inches in the dead of night. Colt discovered it at dawn. He stood at the edge of his property, looking at the fresh holes in the ground where the stakes had been and the new holes a few paces away. The earth around them was scuffed with fresh boot prints. It was a brazen act of provocation, a taunt. They were daring him to react, hoping he would reach for the Colt revolver that hung, always holstered, at his hip. A violent response would give Burke the excuse he needed to bring in the law and have him removed from the land for good. But Colt didn't draw his weapon. His face was a thundercloud of controlled fury, but his hands remained steady at his sides. He walked back to one of the original stone markers, a large, flat rock that his father had carved a simple H into decades ago. He knelt beside it. The new wooden stake was now a full 10 yards inside this line. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and tore a long strip of fabric from the sleeve of his own work shirt. The blue cotton was faded and soft from years of wear. With the same silent intensity he had used to fix Lila's wagon, he tied the strip of cloth to the old stone marker. It flapped in the early morning breeze, a small, defiant flag of blue against the dusty brown landscape. It was a promise made to himself, to the land, and to the memory of his father. He would not fight them with bullets. He would not give them the satisfaction of a violent reaction. He would hold this land with sweat and stubbornness, not with gunpowder. He would fight them his own way, and he would not be moved. The work on the telegraph line provided a necessary distraction, a focus for Lila's restless energy. But every evening, when the clicking of the sounder fell silent and the only light in the stone storeroom was the low, steady flame of her lantern, her thoughts would drift to the Harrow Ranch. She saw the defiant scrap of blue cloth tied to the old stone marker, a silent testament to a man's will, and she saw the slow, inexorable tightening of Silas Burke's grip on the town. One night, a persistent feeling of unease kept her from her work. A new shipment of insulators had arrived, and she had promised Father Michael she would move the empty crates to the church's main barn to be used for firewood. As she crossed the churchyard, the air was unnaturally still. The moon was a pale ghost behind a high, thin veil of clouds. The night was dark, and the silence felt heavy, watchful. As she approached the barn, a scent reached her, cutting through the familiar smells of hay and old wood. It was a sharp, chemical odor, greasy and invasive. Kerosene. It had no place here. The church used candles and the occasional oil lamp, but this was a thick, pervasive smell, as if a great quantity had been spilled. Her hand went to the small lantern she carried, pushing open the heavy barn door, which groaned in protest. She raised the light. The interior was a cavern of shifting shadows. Beams of timber crisscrossed the darkness above. The air inside was thick with the acrid smell, so strong it made her eyes water. She saw the empty crates stacked against the far wall, just as she'd left them. But something was wrong. The floor was covered in a deep layer of straw, left over from a recent donation. It was dry from the long drought, perfect tinder, and yet it wasn't right. Lila lowered the lantern, her boots whispering in the straw. Dark streaks, like greasy black veins, snaked across the floor. They were wet, glistening in the lamplight. The straw in these patches was dark and heavy. Someone had deliberately soaked the barn floor with kerosene. A cold dread, sharper and more immediate than the fear she'd felt during the twister, washed over her. She knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this barn shared a fence line with the Harrow property. A fire here, a big one, would not stay contained. She backed out of the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't think. She ran. She ran from the churchyard, down the dark, empty Main Street, and onto the wagon road that led out of town. The 2 miles to the Harrow ranch had never seemed so long. She ran until her lungs burned and a stitch flared in her side, her mind a frantic whirl of flickering flames and the acrid smell of kerosene. She found Colt in his own barn, mending a piece of harness by the light of a single lantern. The small space was warm and smelled of leather and his horse, a comforting, honest scent that stood in stark contrast to what she had just left behind. He looked up as she stumbled through the doorway, his face a mask of surprise in the golden light. "The church barn," she gasped, leaning against the doorframe, trying to catch her breath. "Kerosene, someone's poured it everywhere." Colt didn't ask questions. He didn't waste a single second on words. He set down the harness, and the look on his face hardened, the weary lines deepening into something flinty and dangerous. He grabbed his own lantern and strode past her, his long legs eating up the ground. Lila, her breath still ragged, hurried to keep up. They reached the church barn together, 2 small figures in the vast, silent dark. Colt pushed the door open and stepped inside, holding his lantern high. He surveyed the scene with a practiced, assessing eye, his gaze missing nothing. He knelt, touching the soaked straw with his fingertips, then sniffing them. He didn't need her to tell him what it was. "The hay's too dry," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This much fuel, it would go up like a torch. Jump the fence to my north pasture before anyone could even get a bucket brigade going." "It's not just about your pasture," Lila said, her own mind racing, putting the pieces together. "A fire, even if it's contained, on property bordering yours. After that notice you were sent, they could call it a hazard. Say you can't manage your fence line. Burke could use it as leverage. Petition the circuit judge to have the land condemned. It's an excuse. Someone wants to stage a fire to give them grounds for seizure." Colt's eyes met hers in the gloom. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. She understood. He knew she was right. His gaze dropped, scanning the floor, searching. His lantern cast long, dancing shadows as he moved deeper into the barn. Then he stopped. Near the stack of crates, half hidden in the shadows, was a small, dark object. He bent down and picked it up. It was an old tin can, the kind that held machine oil or kerosene. It was nearly empty. He turned it over in his hands, his movements careful. The lantern light glinted off the metal, and then he saw it. Pressed into a smear of greasy residue on the side of the can was a clear, perfect handprint, and within that handprint, 3 parallel lines, slightly raised, where the flesh had healed into thick ridges of scar tissue. Colt stared at the print. He had seen that mark before. He had seen it on the hand that held a whiskey glass in the Red Lantern saloon, the hand that had rested on the butt of a holstered pistol, the hand of the man named Pike. At that exact moment, a new sound intruded on the night. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration, felt more than heard, coming through the hard-packed earth. It grew steadily, resolving into the unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Not one rider, but several, moving at a walk, trying for stealth. Instantly, Colt's body went rigid. Every line of him was alert, a predator sensing a threat. With a flick of his wrist, he extinguished the flame in his lantern, plunging the barn into near total darkness. The only light was the small, flickering flame of Lila's lamp. "Kill the light," he whispered, his voice urgent. He moved toward her, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows. He took the lantern from her hand and blew it out. Now the darkness was absolute, disorienting. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not rough. "This way, and stay low." He pulled her across the straw-covered floor, his movements silent and sure-footed. He knew the layout of this barn. He led her to a long, low watering trough that ran along the back wall, a massive thing carved from a single log. "Get behind it," he commanded in a whisper. "Don't make a sound." They crouched together in the narrow space between the rough-hewn wood of the trough and the stone wall of the barn. The space was tight, forcing them into a strained intimacy. Lila could feel the solid warmth of his body pressed against hers. The air was thick with the smells of kerosene, dust, and their own sharp, anxious breath. She could hear the frantic drumming of her own heart, and she was sure he could hear it too. Their breaths mingled in the cold, confined space. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped. There was the soft creak of saddle leather, the jingle of a harness, and the low murmur of men's voices. They were just outside the barn door. "You sure this is the right time?" one voice asked. A nervous, reedy sound. "Burke said tonight." A second, deeper voice answered. It was Pike. "Said the preacher's in bed and the new telegraph girl is probably messing with her wires. No one's around. Get it done." A shadow fell across the open doorway. A man stood silhouetted against the slightly less black square of the night sky. Pike. He peered into the darkness, his eyes trying to adjust. "Smell that," he said with a low chuckle. "Smells like progress." He stepped inside, followed by two other men. They were nothing more than dark shapes in the gloom. Lila held her breath, pressing herself harder against the cold stone wall, trying to will herself to become invisible. "Just needs a spark," Pike said. He fumbled in his coat pocket. There was the scratch of a matchstick, and a tiny flare of light bloomed in the darkness, illuminating his face for a brief, startling moment. His features were coarse, his eyes small and mean. He lit a hand-rolled cigarette, the orange tip glowing brightly as he inhaled. "Let's get this over with." He took one more drag from the cigarette. Then, with a casual, contemptuous flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the center of the barn. It landed in a patch of the most heavily soaked straw. There was no immediate explosion, just a soft whoosh. A small, hungry patch of blue and orange flame appeared, licking at the greasy straw. It began to spread with terrifying speed, a creeping circle of light that pushed back the darkness and threatened to consume everything. Before a coat could move, before the thought had even fully formed in his mind, Lila acted. Beside the trough lay a heavy canvas tarp, folded and forgotten. In one desperate, fluid motion, she lunged for it. She grabbed the thick fabric and, with a strength born of pure adrenaline, flung it out over the growing flames. The heavy canvas billowed and then fell, covering the fire completely. There was a muffled, angry hiss as the flames were starved of air. Lila didn't wait. She scrambled on top of the tarp, stamping on it with her boots, trying to smother any remaining embers. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her right foot as a stubborn ember burned through the canvas and the thin leather of her sole. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain, but she didn't stop until she was certain the last spark was dead. The sudden burst of light and motion had broken the spell. Pike and his men, startled, spun around. "What the hell?" But they never finished the sentence. From the darkness behind the trough, Colt Harrow erupted. He moved with a silent, terrifying speed. He wasn't a man anymore. He was pure, focused retribution. He ignored the other two men and went straight for Pike. Pike, recovering his senses, reached for his knife, a long, ugly blade that appeared in his hand as if by magic. But he was too slow. Colt was on him. He didn't draw his own weapon to shoot. Instead, he gripped the heavy Colt revolver by the barrel, using it as a club. He brought the steel butt of the gun down in a short, brutal arc, connecting with Pike's wrist with a sickening crunch. The knife clattered to the floor. Pike howled in pain, clutching his shattered wrist. The other two men, seeing their leader so swiftly and brutally dispatched, froze in indecision. It was in that moment of shocked silence that a new sound cut through the night. It was the clear, urgent tolling of the church bell. Clang, clang, clang. Father Michael, awakened by the commotion or perhaps by some divine premonition, was sounding the alarm. The sound broke the paralysis. Shouts echoed from the town. Lights began to appear in the windows of the houses down the street. The two thugs exchanged a panicked look, then turned and fled, melting back into the darkness they had come from, abandoning their leader. Pike, cradling his broken hand, glared at Colt with pure hatred. "You'll pay for this, Harrow," he spat. Colt didn't answer. He stood over him, the revolver now held properly in his hand. Its dark muzzle pointed unwaveringly at Pike's chest. Doors were slamming open all over town. A crowd of people, some still in their nightshirts, carrying lanterns and rifles, began to converge on the churchyard. They found a strange tableau Colt Harrow, standing like a statue of vengeance over a groaning Pike, and Lila Quinn, leaning against the water trough, her face pale, trying to favor a foot that was now burning with agony. A minute later, another figure appeared, moving through the crowd with an air of authority. It was Silas Burke. He was fully dressed, as if he had been expecting to be called out. He surveyed the scene, his face a perfect mask of surprise and concern. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice booming with false indignation. "A fire here, is everyone all right?" He looked from Colt to Pike, his eyes wide with feigned astonishment. But as he did, his gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, a darting, almost imperceptible glance into the deep shadows behind the stacked crates, to the exact spot where the discarded kerosene can lay, hidden from view. No one else saw it, but Lila, watching him from her pained vantage point, saw it clearly. And she knew. She knew with the same cold certainty she had felt when she first smelled the kerosene. Burke wasn't surprised at all. He was just disappointed that his plan had failed. The town dispersed as quickly as it had gathered, the initial adrenaline giving way to weary murmurs and sideways glances at Silas Burke, whose performance of civic concern had convinced no one. The circuit judge was away for another week, and the town's part-time sheriff, a man named Cobb, took Pike into custody with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. It was his word against Colt's. And in Dry Creek, Burke's money often spoke louder than the truth. The aftermath left Colt and Lila standing alone in the churchyard, suspended in a strange, quiet bubble. The excitement had passed, leaving behind the heavy smells of kerosene and damp earth. A low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, a postscript to the evening's violence. And then, a soft, tentative rain began to fall. It was not a storm. It was a gentle, hesitant drizzle, the kind of rain the parched land had been praying for. But it was enough to turn the dusty roads into a slick, impassable mire of red mud. Colt looked at the sky, then at the road back to town, and finally at Lila, who was trying not to put weight on her injured foot. The burn on her soul, though small, was throbbing with a fierce, insistent pain. "You can't walk back on that," he stated. It wasn't a question or an offer, but a simple declaration of fact. The road will be soup. He didn't wait for her to agree or protest. He walked over to his buckskin, which had stood patiently through the entire ordeal, and led it over to her. With a quiet efficiency that was becoming familiar, he helped her into the saddle, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist as he lifted her. He took the reins and began to walk, leading the horse away from the town, toward the light of his own distant ranch house. They moved through the falling rain in silence. The world was soft and gray. The only sounds the gentle hiss of the rain on the dusty ground and the rhythmic plodding of the horses' hooves. The light from his house was a single, steady point of yellow in the overwhelming dark, a beacon of warmth and safety. Inside, the house was spare and impeccably clean. It was a man's space, built of sturdy wood and pragmatism. There was a stone fireplace, a simple table and 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area along one wall. Everything had its place. Nothing was extraneous. He led her to one of the chairs and gently helped her down. "Sit," he said, his voice low in the quiet room. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a basin of cool water from the pump and a roll of clean white cloth. He knelt before her, his movements unhurried. He didn't ask for permission. He simply took her foot into his hands. His hands were rough, calloused from years of hard labor, the knuckles scarred, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He carefully removed her boot, then her stocking, revealing the angry red patch on her sole where the ember had burned through. Lila flinched, not from the pain, but from the unexpected intimacy of the act. No one had tended to her so carefully since she was a child. He began to clean the burn, his fingers moving with a focused, deliberate tenderness. The cool water was a balm, easing the fire in her skin. He worked in complete silence, his attention entirely on the task. The only sounds in the room were the soft whisper of the rain against the window panes and the quiet crackle of the fire he had quickly kindled in the hearth. When he was finished cleaning it, he wrapped her foot in a clean, tight bandage of white cloth. The neat, efficient folds were a testament to a man accustomed to tending his own wounds. He finished the knot and looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. The firelight played across the hard planes of his face, softening the weary lines. The quiet in the room was a living thing, full of unspoken words. Lila looked down at the neatly bandaged foot, a stark white shape in the firelight. She thought of the chaos in the barn, of his silent, explosive defense of her, of the long, silent walk through the rain. He had done all of this, had risked everything, without a single promise, without a word of reassurance. He simply acted. "It's my first time," she whispered, the words barely disturbing the stillness of the room. She wasn't talking about the rain, or the fire, or the injury. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Waiting. "I trusted a man who made no promises." Colt Harrow did not reply. He held her gaze for a long moment, and something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, a deep and quiet acknowledgement, but he offered no words. Words were not his currency. He rose to his feet and turned away, moving toward the small sleeping alcove at the back of the main room. It was barely a room, just a space curtained off with a heavy blanket, containing a simple bed frame. He was offering her his bed, the only one in the house, but before he stepped past the threshold into the main living space where she sat, he did something that stopped her breath in her throat. He bent down and, with slow, methodical movements, undid the laces of his own heavy, mud-caked boots. He pulled them off, one after the other, and placed them neatly by the door, on the rough mat just inside the entrance. Then, in his stockinged feet, he walked silently across the clean-swept wooden floor. He had built this house with his father. He had scrubbed these floors. He kept his home, his sanctuary, clean from the mud and the filth of the outside world, and he would not track it into the space where she was to rest. It was a gesture of respect so profound, so deeply ingrained in his character, that it spoke more loudly than any declaration could have. He paused by the hearth, picked up a small iron pot of bean soup that had been warming there, and ladled a generous portion into a thick crockery bowl. He brought it not to the table, but to the front porch, which was covered by a low overhang, protecting it from the rain. He set the bowl of soup on the top step, next to a spoon and a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth. Then he retreated, leaving the offering there for her, a silent invitation that imposed no obligation. He disappeared into the barn, giving her the privacy of the house, letting his quiet actions speak for him. Lila sat for a long time, listening to the rain. The warmth from the fire seeped into her bones, chasing away the chill of the night. After a while, she carefully made her way to the door. The bowl of soup sat waiting, steam rising from it in a fragrant, inviting cloud. She picked it up, the warmth spreading through her hands. As she turned back into the room, her eyes fell upon the floorboards. There, leading from the doorway to the hearth and back, were the faint, damp outlines of his stockinged feet. The marks were already beginning to fade as they dried, but the image of them, of his quiet, deliberate act of consideration, was burned into her memory. A feeling bloomed in her chest, a slow, gentle warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the soup. It felt like safety. Her gaze drifted around the room, taking in the details she had missed before. On a small, hand-carved mantelpiece above the fire, there was a single, silver-framed photograph. She hobbled closer, drawn by an unspoken curiosity. It was a formal portrait of a woman, her hair pulled back in a severe style, but her mouth was curved in a gentle, tired smile. Her eyes, even in the faded black and white of the photograph, held the same deep-set weariness and quiet strength that Lila saw in Colt. This had to be his mother. The smile was not one of easy joy, but of a hard-won peace. Lila looked from the woman's face to the clean-swept floors, the neatly stacked firewood, the mended curtains on the window. She understood that this house had not always been silent. It had once been a home, filled with the quiet rhythms of a family. Hanging on a wooden peg by the door was the canvas work coat he always wore. She noticed a long, jagged tear in the fabric near the hem, a fresh rip that hadn't been there before. She recognized it instantly. It was the kind of tear that would come from fabric catching on a splintered piece of wood, or perhaps the sharp edge of a stone marker being wrenched from the hard earth. This was the cost of his defiance, a small, physical manifestation of his silent war. On a small shelf near the kitchen, she saw a wooden sewing box. It was his mother's. She was certain. Opening it, she found spools of thick, sturdy thread, needles, and a thimble. Without a second thought, she took the coat from its peg. Sitting back down in the chair by the fire, she threaded a needle with a dark brown thread that matched the faded canvas almost perfectly. And she began to sew. Her stitches were small, neat and even. The needle moved in a slow, rhythmic dance, in and out of the thick fabric. The act was meditative, a way of bringing order to the frayed edges of the day. She was not just mending a tear in a piece of cloth. She was mending something deeper. It was a silent conversation, a response to his silent acts of kindness. He had cleaned her wound. She would mend his coat. He had offered her shelter. She would help restore his armor against the world. Each stitch was a quiet thank you, a small knot of solidarity. She was just finishing when he returned from the barn, his hair damp with rain. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene, the empty soup bowl on the table, the coat lying across her lap, the needle in her hand. He didn't speak. He simply watched her tie off the final knot and snip the thread. She folded the coat and placed it on the table. He gave a single, slow nod. Then he took a blanket from a chest and went to the far side of the room, near the fireplace, where he settled onto the floor, his back against the wall. He was giving her the bed and taking the hard floor for himself without comment or complaint. That night, they slept in the same small house, separated by a few yards of wooden floor and a world of silence. Lila lay in his bed, the sheets smelling faintly of sun-dried cotton and pine. She could hear the soft sound of his breathing across the room, a steady, rhythmic presence in the dark, outside. The wind whispered through the tall pine trees that surrounded the house, a sound like the sighing of the earth itself. The rain fell, a gentle, cleansing drumbeat on the roof. They were two strangers, thrown together by violence and circumstance, each bearing their own scars, their own deep-seated loneliness, but in the quiet darkness of the small house, surrounded by the sounds of the rain and the wind, they were not alone. They were two people who had chosen not to run. The first gray light of dawn crept through the window, painting the room in soft shades of silver and rose. A bird began to sing, its clear, hopeful notes cutting through the quiet of the morning. This was their first time. It had nothing to do with a touch or a kiss. It was the first time, for both of them. They had faced a storm and not turned away. It was the first time they had found shelter not in a place, but in the quiet, unspoken understanding of another human being. It was the first time they had chosen to stay. The rain, which had offered a brief, gentle respite, was gone as quickly as it had come. It did little to quench the thirst of the land, but it settled the dust and left the air clean and smelling of wet sagebrush. The peace, however, was short-lived. By the next day, a new kind of dust was being kicked up in Dry Creek, the dust of rumor. It started in the general store, a low-voiced comment between two ranchers buying coffee. It spread to the blacksmith's forge, whispered over the ring of the hammer on the anvil. By noon, it had reached the Red Lantern Saloon, where it was watered with whiskey and grew into a confident, ugly certainty. Silas Burke was making his final move. Tonight, he had invited the handful of small ranchers who shared the aquifer men already weakened by the drought and intimidated by his legal maneuvering to a friendly game of poker. The subtext was clear. It wasn't a game. It was a foreclosure. Dressed up in the trappings of saloon camaraderie, Burke intended to walk out of the Red Lantern that night owning every drop of water in the valley. Lila heard the news from Mrs. Peters, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose quiet demeanor hid a sharp ear for the town's undercurrents. "He's going to ruin them," Mrs. Peters said, her hands twisting in her apron. "He'll get them in his debt over the cards, then offer to forgive it in exchange for their signatures on his new water deeds. They're good men, but they're desperate." A cold knot of anger and fear tightened in Lila's stomach. This was the final act. The checkmate in a game Colt Harrow hadn't even known he was playing. She finished her business, her mind racing. She knew what she had to do. She found Colt where she expected to find him in his parched northern pasture, digging a new post hole with a grim, relentless rhythm. He worked under the hot afternoon sun, his shirt soaked with sweat, his movements fueled by a quiet, simmering fury. He saw her approaching but didn't stop his work. He drove the post hole digger into the hard earth, his muscles cording with the effort. "They say Burke is holding a poker game tonight," Lila said, stopping a few feet away. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "At the Red Lantern. He's invited the other ranchers. He's planning to take their water rights for good." Colt grunted, heaving a load of dry soil from the hole. "That's his business." "It's your business, too," she countered, her voice sharp. "Your name is on that list. You know it is. He's just saving you for last." "I don't play poker with snakes," he said, his voice flat and hard. He refused to look at her, his focus entirely on the hole he was digging, as if he could bury the problem in the unyielding ground. "This isn't a choice," Lila insisted, stepping closer. The heat rising from the ground was palpable. "You can't just ignore this and hope it goes away. He's consolidating his power. Once he has the other ranchers' signatures, he'll have the legal standing to isolate you completely. He'll build a dam, divert what's left of the creek, and your well won't last a month. You have to be there." He finally stopped, resting on the handles of the digger, his chest rising and falling heavily. He wiped a forearm across his sweat-beaded brow, leaving a muddy streak. "And do what, Miss Quinn? I have no money to bet. He knows that. He wants me there to be humiliated, to be made an example of. I won't give him the satisfaction." Lila looked him square in the eye, her own gaze unwavering. "Then you'll give him your land instead. You have to go, Mr. Harrow, in a place like this. There's only one rule that matters. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu." The words hung in the hot, still air between them. It was a brutal, cynical piece of wisdom, and it was undeniably true. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not defeat, but a grim, reluctant understanding. He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching out, filled only by the buzz of insects in the dry grass. Then, without another word, he threw the post-hole digger to the ground, turned, and strode toward the house. An hour later, as twilight began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, they rode into town together. Colt had washed, his face clean-shaven, his dark hair still damp. He wore a clean blue shirt, the one she had mended, and his canvas coat. He looked less like a weary rancher and more like a soldier heading into battle. He was silent, his face set in hard, unreadable lines. But he rode with a straight-backed resolve that hadn't been there before. The Red Lantern saloon was crowded, the air thick with smoke, whiskey, and the low hum of nervous conversation. When Colt Harrow pushed through the swinging doors with Lila Quinn a step behind him, the room fell into a sudden, shocked silence. Every eye turned to them. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. A man in the middle of telling a loud joke let his punchline die in his throat. Colt's reclusiveness was legendary, and for him to appear here, with the telegraph woman in tow, was an event of seismic proportions. At a large round table in the back of the room, Silas Burke sat like a king holding court, Pike, his wrist and hand now wrapped in a thick, dirty bandage, sat at his right hand, his expression a mask of sullen hatred. 3 other ranchers, their faces etched with worry, sat stiffly in their chairs, their hats held in their laps. Burke looked up, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He was not surprised. He was delighted. The final piece of his game had just walked onto the board. "Harrow," Burke said, his voice smooth and welcoming, yet dripping with condescension. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't accept my invitation, and you've brought a guest, Miss Quinn. A pleasure to see you. I trust you're not here to send a telegram." "We're here to play," Colt said, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent room. He pulled out an empty chair and gestured for Lila to sit, before taking the one beside her. His presence, his simple act of claiming a seat at the table, shifted the energy in the room. This was no longer a private slaughter. It was a public spectacle. Burke chuckled, thoroughly enjoying himself. "Excellent. The stakes are simple tonight. Gentlemen, no cash necessary. We're playing for deeds. I have here." He produced a sheaf of freshly printed legal documents from a leather satchel. The new, officially surveyed water deeds, recognized by the Territorial Land Office. "And you," he gestured to the other ranchers, "have your old, outdated, and frankly, quite useless papers." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "I'm proposing a simple trade, validated by a friendly game of 5-card draw. Winner take all, my new deeds against your old ones." It was an audacious, brazenly unfair proposition. He was asking them to wager their heritage against a legal fiction he himself had created. The other ranchers looked down at the table, their faces grim. They knew it was a swindle, but they were trapped, too afraid and too beaten down to refuse. "I'll play," one of the ranchers, a man named Henderson, said, his voice barely a whisper. The other 2 mumbled their assent. Burke turned his smiling gaze on Colt. "And you, Harrow, what do you have to wager your old deed is already worthless, according to my survey?" The entire saloon was watching, waiting. Colt's face was impassive. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. For a moment, some of the onlookers tensed, thinking he might be reaching for his gun. Instead, he pulled out 2 folded pieces of paper and placed them, deliberately, in the center of the table. "This," he said, tapping the first paper, "is a signed contract guaranteeing the sale of my entire hay crop for next season to the Union Pacific Railroad at a premium price. He then tapped the second, heavier document. And this is a signed lease agreement with that same railroad for the right-of-way for their new telegraph line across my land. An annual fee payable in advance. He looked Burke directly in the eye. My future against your paper. A low murmur went through the crowd. This was unexpected. The railroad contract was real money, a tangible asset. It proved that Harrow wasn't beaten yet. Lila felt a surge of pride. He had listened. He had used the tools she had given him not as a crutch, but as a weapon. Burke's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. He hadn't counted on this, but he recovered quickly, his arrogance reasserting itself. A bold play. Harrow. Betting on a crop that hasn't even been planted in a field that may not have water? Very well. I accept your wager. The game began. The cards were dealt. The tension in the room so thick you could taste it. Lila sat beside Colt, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was not just an observer. She felt like a part of the stake. Her work, her belief in him, laid out on the table. The first two hands went to the other ranchers, small wins that Burke allowed to give the illusion of a fair game. The third hand, Burke won, taking Henderson's deed with a casual flick of his wrist. Henderson seemed to shrink in his chair. A lifetime of work erased by a pair of jacks. The final hand was dealt. It was between Burke, Colt, and Pike. The betting was finished. It was time for the draw. The room was deathly quiet. All that could be heard was the soft riffle of the cards and the nervous breathing of the onlookers. Colt stood pat with the 5 cards he was dealt. Burke drew 1. Pike, with a smirk, drew 3. Lila watched Pike's hands. She remembered the scars, the arrogance, the way he moved with the slick confidence of a man who believes he can't lose because he never plays fair. He picked up his new cards, arranging them with his one good hand. As he did, his other arm, the one with the bandaged wrist, rested on the edge of the table. His sleeve had a wide cuff, and for a split second, as he shifted his weight, she saw it, a flash of white, the corner of a playing card. Her mind went into overdrive. He was holding a card out, an ace, most likely. He was waiting for the right moment to slip it into his hand. How could she expose him without starting a gunfight? Shouting would be useless. It would be her word against his, and Burke would back his man. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a solution. Her gaze fell upon her own small handbag, sitting on her lap. Inside was her coin purse, a handkerchief, and a small, silver-backed pocket mirror she used for checking her hair. The mirror, with movements that she hoped looked natural. She opened her bag, feigning a search for her handkerchief. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth surface of the mirror, keeping it below the level of the table. She angled it, trying to catch a reflection. The light in the saloon was dim, coming from oil lamps that cast long, flickering shadows. Pike laid his cards down with a triumphant slap. "Full house," he declared, his voice full of smug satisfaction. "Aces over 8s. He showed 3 aces and 2 8s. It was a powerful hand, almost certainly a winning one. Burke smiled, preparing to rake in the pot. At that moment, Lila, pretending to fix a stray strand of hair, lifted the small mirror. She didn't look at Pike. She looked at the wall behind him. For a fraction of a second, she caught the light from the lamp over the bar and reflected it. A small, bright circle, directly onto Pike's left cuff. The light illuminated the sliver of white that was still peeking out, the ace of spades. A man standing behind Pike, who had been craning his neck to see the hand, saw the flash of light and the card. His eyes went wide. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cracking with surprise. "He's got a card up his sleeve." The accusation exploded in the silent room. Every head snapped toward Pike. Pike, his face a mixture of shock and fury, instinctively moved to cover his cuff, but it was too late. The man who had shouted, emboldened by the support of the crowd now murmuring angrily around him, reached out and grabbed Pike's arm. He yanked the sleeve up. The ace of spades fluttered from the cuff and landed face up on the table. The saloon erupted. The illusion of a friendly game was shattered, revealing the ugly reality of a fixed contest. Men shouted, chairs were scraped back, and several onlookers put their hands on their pistols. "It's a cheat!" someone yelled. "Burke's whole game is crooked." Burke shot to his feet, his face pale with fury. "This is an outrage. My man has been wrongly accused." But no one was listening. The anger of the dispossessed ranchers, long suppressed, finally had a voice. "We want the judge," Henderson shouted, finding his courage in the crowd. "Get Judge Alden down here. We'll settle this with the law, not with marked cards." The call was taken up by others. Judge Alden was a respected, if stern, figure in the territory. He was known to be a man who, while he enjoyed a drink, did not suffer fools or cheats. Someone was dispatched to his rooms at the hotel, and, minutes later, the judge appeared. A tall, imposing man with a thick white mustache, pulling on his coat over his nightshirt. He surveyed the scene with a practiced, weary eye, his gaze taking in the damning card on the table, Pike's panicked face, and Burke's barely controlled rage. He listened to 3 different men tell the story at once, then held up a hand for silence. "Enough," he commanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the noise. He looked at the deeds on the table, at Colt's contracts, and at the faces of the men involved. He was a man who understood the nuances of frontier justice, where legalities and public sentiment often collided. "I see no evidence of a fair game here," he said, his eyes locking on Burke. "I see a situation ripe for coercion and fraud." He picked up a rubber stamp and an ink pad from the bar, where the saloon keeper used it for receipts. He slammed the stamp down on Burke's pile of new deeds, one after another. The word void appeared in stark purple ink on each one. "All transactions regarding water rights in this valley are hereby suspended," Judge Alden declared, his voice ringing with authority. "A formal independent survey will be conducted, sponsored by my court. Until then, the original historical boundaries and deeds will stand as law." Burke's face went from pale to a deep, mottled red. His composure, his most valuable asset, finally shattered. He had been outmaneuvered, his scheme exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his voice rising, losing its smooth, controlled edge. "You can't do that. The original boundaries are meaningless, the old markers. Nobody can even prove where they were." He stopped, realizing what he had said. The words, born of pure, frustrated rage, hung in the now silent room. It was a confession, a public admission that he knew the old markers had been moved or destroyed, and that his entire claim was based on the fact that the original evidence was gone. Judge Alden raised a single, white eyebrow. A slow, knowing look passed between him and several of the older ranchers in the room. Colt Harrow didn't even look at Burke. He had won. Not with a gun, not with fists, but with patience and a partner he was just beginning to understand. He turned his head and looked at Lila. Her face was pale in the lamplight, but her eyes were shining with a fierce, triumphant light. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached out and his large, calloused hand closed gently around her wrist. It wasn't a gesture of possession or restraint. It was a simple, solid connection. His thumb rested on her pulse point, and she could feel the steady, reassuring beat. The warmth of his skin spread through her, a silent current of gratitude, of partnership, of a victory shared. It was the only thank you he needed to give, and the only one she needed to receive. Judge Alden was a man who believed in momentum. He did not let the embers of the saloon confrontation cool. The very next evening, as a full, milky moon climbed a sky of bruised velvet, he assembled his own survey party. It was a strange procession that made its way out of Dry Creek, their lanterns creating small, bobbing pools of yellow light. There was the judge himself, his tall frame radiating an implacable authority. Father Michael, his presence a quiet appeal to conscience, and the three ranchers whose land and lives hung in the balance. And at the head of the group walked Colt Harrow and Lila Quinn. They made their way to the dry arroyo, the place where the world had been broken and remade by the twister. The moonlight was so bright, it bleached the color from the landscape, turning the red dust to silver and the dark stones to lumps of charcoal. The air was cool and still, and every sound carried the crunch of boots on gravel, the nervous cough of one of the ranchers, the distant, lonely call of a coyote. The land itself felt like a witness, ancient and silent, waiting to see if the crimes committed upon it would be brought to light. Silas Burke and his man Pike were there, too. The judge had compelled their attendance. They stood apart from the main group, two resentful shadows, their arms crossed. Burke's face was a mask of bored contempt, but Lila could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes darted from the judge to the land and back again. "The court is now in session," Judge Alden announced, his voice echoing in the vast, quiet space. "We are here to find the truth of the matter. We are here to find the old stones." What followed was not a traditional survey with transits and chains. It was something older, a piecing together of memory and landscape. The ranchers pointed out landmarks they remembered from their youth: a lightning-scarred cottonwood, a peculiar outcropping of rock. But the twister had scoured the land, and the creek bed itself had shifted. Memories were hazy, conflicting. For an hour, they found nothing definitive, and a sense of futility began to settle over the group. Burke smirked, his confidence growing with each failed attempt. It was then that Lila stepped forward. In her hands, she held her telegrapher's logbook and a bundle of small wooden stakes connected by a long, thin strand of copper wire. "Judge," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The original county survey from 1855 is on file at the land office. I had them telegraph me the coordinates and descriptions this afternoon." Burke let out a short, derisive laugh. "Coordinates, Miss Quinn. We are not at sea. We are in a ditch. Those numbers are meaningless out here." "Not if you have a fixed point of reference," she replied, not looking at him. "And a way to measure straight lines. The old survey notes that the Harrow property line begins exactly 220 yards due west of the church steeple." She turned to Colt. "The church hasn't moved, has it?" A flicker of something respect, surprise passed through his eyes. "No, ma'am," he said. "It hasn't." For the next hour, Lila worked with a quiet, focused intensity. She was no longer just a telegrapher. She was a geometer, a cartographer of the truth. With Colt's help, she established the starting point. Then, using the length of her wire as a measuring chain and the constellations as her guide, she began to lay out a grid upon the dry creek bed. She hammered in small stakes, connecting them with the thin copper wire, creating a map of perfect, shining lines across the chaotic landscape. It was a beautiful, simple science, the clean logic of dots and dashes and straight lines imposed upon a place that had been defined by deceit and brute force. The moonlight glinted off the copper wires, making it look as if she were stringing a constellation on the ground to match the one in the sky. As her grid took shape, it became clear that the new wooden stakes Burke had planted were a flagrant lie, sometimes as much as 20 yards inside the line she was creating. A low murmur went through the assembled ranchers. This was evidence they could understand, a truth as plain and straight as the wires themselves. As Lila worked her way down the creek bed, Father Michael, who had been examining the ground with a scholar's quiet curiosity, let out a small cry of discovery. "Over here," he called, his voice thin with excitement. He was pointing at the ground near the bank, at a series of deep, parallel ruts in the earth that had been hidden by a thicket of salt cedar. They were wagon tracks, and clinging to the edges of the ruts, preserved in the dry air, were patches of a distinctive, deep red mud. "That's the clay," one of the ranchers said, his voice full of dawning comprehension. From Burke's Pit, east of town. He looked from the tracks to Pike, whose bandaged hand was now shoved deep in his pocket. The same mud that was on your boots in the saloon. The tracks, now that they knew to look for them, were unmistakable. They led from the direction of the clay pit directly to a large, windowless warehouse on the edge of Burke's property, a building that everyone had assumed was used for storing mining equipment. The evidence was building, piece by piece, a chain of circumstance that was becoming as strong as iron. Burke scoffed, though his voice had a new, brittle edge. A wagon in a creek bed. It's absurd. This proves nothing. But the tide of opinion had turned. The whispers among the ranchers were no longer uncertain. They were the low, angry hum of men who realized they had been systematically cheated. Lila, following the logical conclusion of her copper line, stopped at a large, flat slab of granite embedded in the bank, half overgrown with stubborn sagebrush. According to the telegraphed survey notes, this was where the final boundary markers should be. The surface of the stone looked blank, weathered by decades of sun and flash floods. Disappointment settled over her. Colt came and stood beside her. He didn't look at the stone with his eyes, but with a different sense, a memory that ran deeper than his own life. He knelt, his calloused fingers tracing the rough surface. The moonlight was bright, but it flattened the landscape, making subtle details disappear. He waited, his posture one of infinite patience. He watched the moon, watched the way its light moved as it arced across the sky. After a few minutes, the angle of the light shifted just so, and for a brief, magical moment, a faint, shallow carving was thrown into relief. It was a single, clear letter. Its lines softened by time but still unmistakable. An H. "My father carved it," Colt said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he rarely showed. He didn't have to say anything else. The silent stone, awakened by the moonlight, spoke for him, a witness across the years. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. It was the final, irrefutable piece of proof. The science of Lila's lines had led them to the history written in stone. Burke's composure finally broke. "A scratch on a rock," he yelled, his voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet arroyo. "That proves nothing. It's a trick. This whole thing is a farce." The townspeople just stared at him, their faces cold and condemning in the moonlight. His blustering was hollow now, the desperate noise of a man who had been caught. The silence that met his outburst was his true judgment. It was in that moment of heavy, damning silence that it happened. A blinding flash of white light erupted from the opposite bank of the creek, near the head of the main irrigation channel. It was followed a split second later by a deafening roar that tore through the night, a deep, guttural explosion that shook the very ground beneath their feet. A geyser of water, rock, and mud shot into the air, momentarily eclipsing the moon. Someone had planted a small dynamite charge. It was a desperate, malicious act, designed not just to destroy the irrigation channel, but to create chaos, to scatter the witnesses and obliterate the evidence in a sudden, violent flood. For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen in shock. Then, instinct took over. The crowd scrambled back, shouting in alarm. Colt didn't run. He didn't even seem to think. His body reacted with the same pure, protective instinct that had driven him into the storm and the fire. He grabbed Lila, his arm wrapping around her like a band of steel, and threw them both sideways into a shallow, sandy ditch at the base of the creek bank. He landed on top of her, shielding her with his own body as the sky rained down debris. Dirt and small stones pelted his back and the ground around them. A shower of water, blasted from the channel, soaked them in an instant. For a few terrifying seconds, the world was nothing but noise, concussion, and the feeling of the solid, unyielding weight of him protecting her from it all. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The rain of earth subsided. The roar of the explosion faded, replaced by the gurgling, sucking sound of water pouring from the breached channel into the dry arroyo. Colt pushed himself up on his elbows, the weight lifting from her. He was silhouetted against the moonlight, his face a mask of grim concern. He looked down at her, his eyes searching hers in the darkness. He had 100 things he could have said, 100 questions he could have asked. But he was Colt Harrow. He spoke with actions, and when words were necessary, he used only the ones that mattered. "You all right?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Lila couldn't speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with a wild mix of fear, relief, and an overwhelming, heart-stopping gratitude. She felt the sting of tears in her eyes, tears for the terror of the explosion, but also for the profound, bone-deep certainty of being shielded, of being worth protecting to this silent, solitary man. Judge Alden was on his feet, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury. The attempt on their lives had vaporized his last shred of judicial restraint. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger toward Pike, whose face was a mask of poorly feigned innocence, though his eyes were wide with panic and he was already trying to back away. "That's enough," the judge's voice boomed, cutting through the chaos. "Sheriff Cobb, arrest that man, arrest him for attempted murder." Pike turned to run, but two of the ranchers, their fear replaced by a cold rage, tackled him and wrestled him to the ground. Silas Burke didn't say a word. He didn't try to defend his man. He simply stood there, his face ashen in the moonlight. The game was over. He had overplayed his hand, and the explosion had been his final, disastrous tell. As the ranchers dragged Pike away, Burke seemed to shrink. He took a single step back, and then another, melting away from the light of the lanterns and the accusing stares of the townspeople, retreating into the deep, welcoming darkness that was now his only refuge. The explosion was not the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of hell. The dynamite, in its final, spiteful act, had flung a shower of burning debris and glowing embers into the tinder-dry prairie grass on the far side of the arroyo. For a moment, nothing happened. The world was consumed with the chaos of Pike's arrest and the gushing water from the breached channel. No one saw the small, insidious sparks. No one noticed as a tiny snake of orange flame awoke in a clump of brittle salt grass, fanned by the sudden draft of the explosion. The wind, which had been still and watchful all evening, began to stir. It was a low, mournful sigh at first, a whisper across the plains. It touched the small flame, nurtured it, gave it courage. The flame tasted the dry grass and found it good. It grew, stretching and reaching, and then the wind gusted, and the fire exploded. It did not creep. It lunged. A line of fire became a sheet became a wall of churning, roaring orange that devoured the silver moonlight and painted the sky with a terrifying, flickering glow. The prairie ignited, the sound a deafening, continuous roar, punctuated by the sharp crackle and pop of resinous sagebrush exploding like small arms fire. The smell hit them next, the thick, acrid scent of a world being consumed. For a heartbeat, the assembled people of Dry Creek stood frozen, their victory over human greed instantly dwarfed by a battle against an elemental fury. Then, training and instinct took over. Colt Harrow did not waste a single moment on shock. His eyes, hard and calculating, assessed the speed of the fire, the direction of the wind. His first thought was not for his house, not for himself, but for his herd. The small band of cattle, the sum total of his worldly wealth, was grazing in the very pasture toward which the fire was racing. He moved without a word, a blur of motion in the firelight. He vaulted onto the back of his buckskin and with a sharp cry, galloped toward the threatened pasture, a lone rider charging into a sea of smoke and flame. Lila's reaction was just as swift, her focus just as immediate. Her mind flashed to the town's temporary schoolhouse, a small, flimsy wooden building not far from the church, where several families on the outskirts of town sent their children. With the men gathered at the arroyo, the women and children would be alone, perhaps unaware of the sudden, racing danger. She began to run, her feet finding purchase on the familiar path back to town, her mind a frantic prayer that she would not be too late. The town, which had been a collection of individuals, became a single, unified organism bent on survival. Father Michael, his face grim, began to ring the church bell. A frantic, continuous clang, clang, clang that cut through the roar of the fire. It was not a call to prayer. It was a call to arms. Men grabbed buckets, shovels, and wet blankets. Women emerged from their houses, their faces pale but resolute, to help. A bucket brigade formed, a desperate, sweating line of humanity stretching from the town's main well to the edge of the fire, passing sloshing buckets from hand to hand. They were throwing teaspoons of water at an inferno, a futile, heroic gesture against the impossible. Colt, a silhouette against the wall of fire, worked with a terrifying, focused calm. He rode into the smoke, his bandana pulled up over his face, his voice a low, urgent call that his cattle knew and trusted. He gathered them, a small, terrified knot of animals, and drove them not away from the fire, but toward it, down into the deep, rocky gully of the arroyo itself. The high, barren dirt walls and the damp sand of the creek bed would be their sanctuary, a firebreak carved by nature. Lila reached the schoolhouse, her lungs burning. She hammered on the door, shouting, and helped a frightened mother gather a handful of sleepy, crying children, leading them away from the flimsy structure and toward the relative safety of the stone church in the center of town. For an hour, they fought. The fire was a living thing, a predator with a malevolent intelligence. It feinted and dodged, sending out fingers of flame to outflank their efforts. The smoke was a choking, blinding fog, and the heat was a physical blow. They fought until their arms ached, their eyes streamed, and their throats were raw from shouting and smoke. And slowly, impossibly, they began to make a difference. They were holding the line, keeping the blaze contained to the open prairie, protecting the edge of the town. A fragile, exhausted sense of hope began to bloom amidst the chaos. And then the wind, the fire's capricious, powerful ally, shifted. It was a cruel, sudden betrayal. The wind, which had been blowing from the south, swung around and began to howl from the west. A collective groan of despair went up from the bucket line. The fire, which they had been fighting on a single front, now had a new direction. It leaped across the firebreak they had so painstakingly created and began a new, inexorable march, driven by the fresh gale, straight toward the one place that had so far been safe, the Harrow Ranch. Colt saw it happen from the arroyo. He saw the wall of flame turn, a monstrous, hungry beast changing its course. He saw it sweep over the rise, and he saw the first hungry licks of flame touch the edge of his hayfield. The dry, brittle grass, his entire crop for the coming year, vanished in a single, explosive whoosh of orange. The fire was no longer a distant threat. It was at his door. He spurred his horse, racing the flames, galloping toward the small, solitary house that was now directly in the path of the inferno. The heat was immense. The air shimmered. He could hear the sound of the old, dry wood of his fences crackling and popping. He reached the yard just as the first wave of superheated air struck the house. The paint on the west-facing wall began to blister and peel. The wooden shingles on the roof, baked dry by years of sun, began to smoke. And then he heard a sound that turned his blood to ice, a sharp, cracking noise, like a whip, as the first shingle gave way to the heat and burst into flame. The townspeople, seeing the new disaster unfolding, abandoned their posts and ran toward the ranch, their buckets now dedicated to a new, more personal fight. Lila, having seen the children to safety, was among them. She ran with a desperate, frantic energy, her heart a cold stone of dread in her chest. She reached the yard to see a scene from a nightmare. The roof was on fire. Embers, carried by the wind, were igniting the dry grass around the foundation. Colt was on the porch, beating at the flames with a wet horse blanket, a solitary, doomed figure fighting to save his world. Lila's eyes darted around the smoke-filled yard, and then to the interior of the house, visible through the open doorway. The main room was thick with smoke, but not yet touched by flame. Her mind flashed to the leather satchel inside the front door, where Colt had placed the precious documents: the railroad contract, the lease agreement, the judge's stamped, voided deeds, all the proof, all the evidence of their victory. It was all in there. She didn't think, she acted. She tied her handkerchief over her mouth and nose and ran, head down, through the doorway and into the blinding, choking smoke. The heat was staggering. Her eyes streamed, and each breath was a searing, painful gasp. She stumbled through the familiar room, now made alien by the smoke. She found the satchel by feel, her fingers closing around the worn leather. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell on the mantelpiece. Through a momentary swirl in the smoke, she saw it the photograph of his mother, her calm, tired smile looking out over the chaos. She grabbed it, a desperate, instinctive act of preservation, and stumbled back toward the door, just as Colt, having seen her run in, appeared in the doorway. He didn't shout. He didn't waste breath on recriminations. He simply dropped the useless blanket, scooped her and her precious cargo into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her back out into the yard, through the rain of falling embers, setting her down on the porch steps, which were, for the moment, untouched by the flames. He stood over her for a single, incandescent moment. The roof was now fully ablaze. The roar was deafening. The house, his home, the only world he had ever known, was dying. He had to go back in. There were things: his father's rifle, a trunk of his parents' belongings that could still be saved. He turned to face the inferno, and then he did the most extraordinary thing Lila had ever seen. He bent down. In the midst of the roaring flames, with his roof about to collapse and his world turning to ash around him, Colt Harrow paused. He methodically, deliberately, unlaced and removed his heavy, soot-covered boots. He placed them, side by side, on the porch steps, and then, in his stockinged feet, he turned and ran back into the burning building. It was an act of such profound, ingrained reverence that it struck Lila with the force of a physical blow. It was not madness. It was a promise. The same quiet, stubborn respect that had compelled him to take off his boots to keep her resting space clean now compelled him to do so in the face of annihilation. He would not track the filth and destruction of the fire into the heart of his home. He would face its death on its own terms. With respect, that silent, impossible gesture was a vow. Whispered to the house itself, I will go in, and I will come out, and I will go in again. I will not abandon you. I will fight for you until this house either stands or falls, but I will not dishonor you. And then the sky broke open. A single, fat drop of rain landed on Lila's cheek, hissing as it evaporated. Another followed, and another. A dark stain appeared on the hot, dry wood of the porch. The hesitant patter became a rush, a roar, and then a deluge. A sudden, violent, heaven-sent cloudburst unleashed its full fury upon Dry Creek. The rain came down in solid, cleansing sheets. It hit the burning roof with a sound like a million angry snakes, sending up vast clouds of steam that momentarily obscured the entire scene. The roar of the fire was replaced by the roar of the downpour. The fire, which had been invincible, faltered. It hissed and sputtered, fighting a losing battle against the sheer volume of water. The people in the yard stood frozen, their face turned up to the sky, letting the blessed, impossible rain wash the soot and tears from their faces. It was over in 20 minutes. The cloudburst passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world that was dripping, black, and steaming. The fire was out. A thick, pungent smell of wet ash hung heavy in the air. Dry Creek had been saved by a miracle, left with nothing more than a thin black blanket of ruin. In the gray, watery light of the newly revealed moon, they surveyed the damage. The prairie was a blackened, smoking wasteland, But the town was safe, and the Harrow Ranch, by the slimmest of margins, had survived. The roof was a charred, skeletal ruin, and the west wall was scorched and blackened, but the main structure, the solid bones of the house, was still standing. Colt emerged from the house, soaked to the skin, his face and arms black with soot. In his hands, he carried a small, water-damaged wooden trunk. He walked to the edge of the porch and stood, looking out at the devastation, at the black scar where his pasture had been. Lila, still sitting on the steps, looked down at the objects in her own lap. The leather of the satchel was soaked, but the papers inside would be safe. And in her other hand, she held the photograph. The silver frame was tarnished with smoke, and the glass was cracked from the heat. But behind the glass, the image of Colt's mother, her face now spattered with drops of rain like tears, was still there, her tired, gentle smile intact. The heart of the house had survived. Dawn broke not with a blaze of glory, but with a soft, hesitant gray light that filtered through a sky scrubbed clean by the rain and scoured by the fire. The air smelled of wet ash, damp earth, and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Dry Creek was wounded, the prairie a black and steaming scar under the morning sky. But it was not broken. The community, forged in the crucible of the night's shared fight, moved with a quiet, unified purpose. There was no talk of waiting for the circuit judge's scheduled visit. Justice, like a fire, could not be left to smolder. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern hills, the entire town had gathered at the church. It was no longer just a house of worship. It was the only building large enough and whole enough to serve as a courthouse, a town hall, and a sanctuary for their battered hopes. They filed in not with righteous anger, but with a solemn gravity. They sat on the hard wooden pews, their faces smudged with soot, their work clothes still damp. Judge Alden stood at the front, before the simple wooden altar, which would serve as his bench. Silas Burke and his man Pike were brought in, flanked by two grim-faced ranchers who had volunteered as deputies. Burke was impeccably dressed, as always, but his clothes could not hide the ruin in his face. His arrogance had been burned away, leaving behind the pale, brittle ash of a man who had lost everything and knew it. The proceedings began without ceremony. There was no jury to select, no lawyers to posture. The entire town was the jury, and the evidence was the witness. "This is not a formal trial," Judge Alden began, his voice filling the quiet, cavernous space. "This is a hearing to establish the truth of a matter that has plagued this community. We will hear the evidence, and we will render a judgment. Miss Quinn, you will begin." Lila stepped forward. She was pale, the lines of exhaustion carved deep around her eyes, but she moved with a calm, unshakable composure. In her hands, she held her logbook and the leather satchel she had rescued from the fire. She did not speak with the passion of an accuser, but with the cool, clear precision of a telegrapher sending a vital message. She started with the telegraphed survey from the land office, reading the precise, clinical language of the original boundaries. Then, using a large piece of charcoal on a spare plank of wood, she drew a map, a simple, clean diagram of the creek bed, the church, and the property lines as they were meant to be. It was the ghost of the copper wire grid she had laid out in the moonlight. "The survey is the law," she stated simply, "and the law begins with a fixed point." She then began to connect the pieces, her voice the steady, clicking rhythm of her sounder, each fact a clear, undeniable signal. The telegraphed survey led us to a stone marker, bearing the initial of the Harrow family, at the exact coordinates specified in the original deed. She paused and looked at Colt, who stood near the front, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The tracks of a wagon were found near the illegally placed stakes. Lila continued. "The mud in those tracks was a unique red clay. Father Michael can attest to seeing it." The priest, his face full of a gentle sorrow, stepped forward. "I can," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It was the clay from the pit east of town. It is unmistakable." "The same clay?" Lila pressed on, her gaze now flicking to Pike. "Was found on the boots of Mr. Pike and his associates in the Red Lantern Saloon on the evening before the markers were moved for a second time." Henderson, the rancher who had lost his deed in the crooked card game, stood up, his voice shaking with a remembered anger. "That's the truth. Caked on 'em. It was. We all saw it." Lila then opened the satchel and produced the oil can Colt had found in the church barn. This can, full of kerosene, was found in the church barn before the attempted arson. The handprint on it shows a distinctive set of 3 scars. She held it up for the judge to see, the same scars visible on Mr. Pike's hand. The chain of evidence was complete, each link forged to the next. The map, the stone, the mud, the wagon tracks, the can, the scars. It was as clear and logical as a line of telegraph poles marching across the prairie, each one leading directly to the next. There was no need for legal theatrics. The truth, once assembled, had a quiet, unassailable power. Judge Alden turned his cold, tired eyes on Pike. "You have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence. The charge of attempting to set the fire in the church barn is in addition to the charge of setting the explosion that nearly killed a dozen people. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Pike looked at Burke, a desperate, pleading glance. He was searching for a sign, for the reassuring nod of a powerful man who would protect his own. But he found nothing. Burke stared straight ahead, his face a blank wall. He was cutting his losses. Pike was on his own. The man's bravado, which had been his stock in trade, crumbled. He slumped, his shoulders sagging. A man utterly defeated. "He told me to do it," Pike mumbled, his voice a sullen, resentful growl. All of it, moving the stakes, the fire, the dynamite. It was Burke's idea. He paid me. A low, angry murmur went through the church. It was the sound of a community's darkest suspicions being confirmed. Judge Alden showed no reaction. He had expected this. He turned his gaze, which was now as hard and unforgiving as granite, upon Silas Burke. "Mr. Burke, you have built your house on a foundation of lies and intimidation. You have attempted to steal not just a man's water, but a community's future. You have perverted the law and substituted greed for justice." The judge picked up his gavel, a simple wooden mallet from the church's tool chest, and struck the altar once. The sound cracked through the silent church like a rifle shot. "It is the judgment of this court that the original boundary lines, as marked by the historical stone markers and confirmed by the official survey, are the one and only true boundaries. The water rights of the Harrow Ranch, and of all other adjacent properties, are hereby restored in full." He paused, letting the words sink in. "As for you, Mr. Burke, this court finds you an amount equal to the full estimated value of the damages caused by the fire and the explosion, to be paid to the town for rebuilding. Furthermore, your ownership of the clay pit, the staging ground for your crimes, is hereby forfeit. It becomes public land." He looked at Pike. "As for you, you will be held for the circuit court on the charge of attempted murder. You will likely spend the rest of your miserable life in a territorial prison." He struck the altar one last time. "This hearing is concluded." For a moment, there was a profound silence. And then, the people of Dry Creek began to applaud. It was not a loud or boisterous sound. It was a soft, rhythmic clapping. A quiet, rolling thunder of respect. It was applause for the verdict, for the judge, and for Lila's clear-headed courage. But most of all, it was for Colt Harrow. It was for the man who had endured, who had refused to be baited, who had fought for his home with sweat and silence. It was a sound that honored his quiet strength, a noise made by people who understood that the deepest waters often run the most still. Silas Burke did not wait to be dismissed. He stood, and for the first time, he looked small. The power he had projected, the aura of invincibility, was gone. He was just a man in an expensive suit, a man who had lost. He turned and walked down the central aisle of the church, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the floor. The townspeople did not jeer or gloat. They simply parted, letting him pass through their midst in a corridor of silent contempt. He walked out of the church, out of their lives, and by noon, a hastily painted for sale sign was hanging, slightly askew, from the balcony of the bank that bore his name. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low, relieved tones. The heavy burden of the past few weeks finally lifted. Soon, only a handful of people remained in the church. Father Michael, Judge Alden, and, standing near the door in a pool of morning sunlight, Colt and Lila. They stood for a long moment in a comfortable, shared silence. The entire world had been unmade and remade around them. They had faced storms, fires, and the very worst of human nature, and they were still standing. Colt turned to face her. The morning light softened the hard lines of his face, and in his gray eyes, there was a depth of emotion she had never seen before. Gratitude, respect, and something more, something deeper and more vulnerable. He opened his mouth, as if to finally give voice to the torrent of unspoken words that lay between them. His lips moved, forming the beginning of a word. And then he stopped. The words would not come. They were foreign to him, clumsy tools for a man who spoke with his hands, his actions, his unwavering presence. To try and capture the enormity of what he felt in a few simple, inadequate syllables felt like a betrayal of the truth itself. The struggle was visible on his face, a profound and heart-wrenching conflict between the need to speak and the inability to do so. He closed his mouth, a look of deep frustration passing over his features, but he did not look away. He let his eyes, clear and honest and full of 1,000 unspoken feelings, say everything that his tongue could not. Lila understood. She understood his struggle, and she understood the silent message in his gaze more clearly than any words he could have spoken. She gave him a small, soft smile, a smile of perfect comprehension. She answered him in his own language. She reached into the pocket of her dress and took out a small, ornate brass key. It was the key to the church storeroom, the key to her telegraph station, the key to her trade and her independent life. She stepped closer to him and, without a word, took his large, calloused, soot-stained hand. She turned it over and placed the key in the center of his palm. "Hold this for me," she said, her voice a soft whisper in the quiet church. She looked up at him, her gaze direct and full of a calm, steady light. "If I stay." The key was small and cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of his hand, a hand that had held tools, reins, and weapons, a hand that had shielded her from harm. He curled his fingers around it, the metal ridges pressing into his flesh. It was an anchor, a promise, a question, and an answer, all in one. He looked down at the key, then back up at her, and the warmth of his hand, the warmth that was spreading through his chest like a slow sunrise, was all the reply he needed. The key was cold, but his heart, for the first time in a long, long time, was hot. The afternoon settled over the Harrow Ranch like a sigh of relief. The sun, low and golden in the western sky, slanted across a landscape that was both ruined and redeemed. The prairie was a vast, blackened quilt, but the rain had washed the air clean, and a new, sweet smell was rising from the wet ash and the wounded earth, the smell of resilience. A gentle wind, a stranger after weeks of hostile gusts, drifted up from the arroyo, carrying the scent of damp soil, the faint, metallic tang of rusted tools, and something else, something warm and domestic, the smell of fresh cornbread cooling on a windowsill. Lila Quinn sat on the top step of the porch, her back resting against one of the sturdy support posts. The house behind her was a patchwork of survival, its main walls standing firm, while its roof was a charred skeleton open to the sky. She felt a similar way, battered and scorched, but fundamentally intact. The white bandage on her foot was dry and no longer throbbed with pain, a quiet testament to the body's slow, steady work of mending. She lifted a hand and touched her hair, feeling the fine, gritty texture of ash that still clung to the strands. She had made no effort to wash it out. It felt like a part of her now, a souvenir from the fire, a reminder of what they had passed through together. She was not waiting for a stagecoach. She was not planning her next destination. For the first time in her adult life, she was simply sitting, letting the quiet of a place soak into her bones. She heard him before she saw him, the soft, rhythmic tread of his footsteps coming from the direction of the barn. Colt rounded the corner of the house, his movements slow and deliberate, not with the weariness of defeat, but with the steady pace of a man who knows the work ahead is long, but is no longer afraid of it. He had spent the day clearing debris, his face and clothes smudged with soot and mud. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at her, his gray eyes quiet and full in the warm, slanted light. He didn't speak. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer a void to be filled or a wall to be scaled. It was a space they now shared, a common ground built of shared peril and unspoken understanding. He stepped up onto the porch, the old wood groaning softly under his weight. But he did not walk past her into the house. Instead, he sat on the step directly opposite her, leaving just a few feet of space between them. And then, with the same slow, methodical grace she had seen him use to fix her wagon, to mend a harness, to bandage her foot, he bent down. He untied the muddy laces of his work boots, the leather stiff with dried muck and soaked through from the rain. He pulled them off, one by one. The sound a soft thud on the porch. He placed them neatly, side by side, next to the doorway. Lila watched, her breath catching in her throat. It was the same gesture she had seen twice before, a gesture of such profound and quiet respect that it had become a language all its own. The first time, it had been a startling act of consideration for a stranger. The second, in the heart of the fire, it had been an impossible, heartbreaking promise to a dying home. But this time, in the calm, golden light of the afternoon, it was something else entirely. It was a vow. The old gesture had a new, profound meaning, and she heard it as clearly as if he had shouted it from the scorched roof. I will keep this home clean for you. I will honor this space we share. I will keep my promises not with words, but with my own two hands. With the work I do, with the life I build. This is how I will love you. A slow, gentle smile touched Lila's lips. She leaned forward slightly, across the small space that separated them, and laid her hand on his leg, just above the knee. Her fingers rested on a patch of dried, red-brown mud that stained the coarse fabric of his trousers. Her hand, which had sent messages of life and death across miles of wire, which had smothered a fire and held a rescued photograph, trembled slightly. But it was also sure, her touch a firm, quiet pressure. It was an answer. I see you, I understand, and I accept. A sound drifted on the evening air. Carried from the pasture down by the arroyo, the low, contented call of a cow to her calf. It was followed by another, more distant sound. The high, clear peal of children's laughter from the churchyard, where life was already, stubbornly, reasserting itself. For the first time since she had arrived, a silence had fallen over Dry Creek that was not tense, or lonely, or menacing. It was peace. Lila felt a profound sense of stillness settle over her. The restless energy that had propelled her from one town to the next, from one temporary station to another, had finally come to rest. The constant, low-grade hum of loneliness, a sound she had lived with for so long she had almost forgotten it was there, was gone. She closed her eyes, not in weariness, but in simple, unadorned contentment. In the soft, warm darkness behind her eyelids, she felt a subtle shift in the air, a change in the light, When she felt the gentle warmth of him near, she did not flinch. She simply waited. Colt leaned across the small space, his movements as slow and unhurried as the setting sun. He touched his lips to hers. The kiss was not one of desperate, pent-up passion. It was short, warm, and chaste, as simple and as vital as a sip of cool water after a long thirst. It was a confirmation, a seal on a silent contract. It held the taste of wood smoke, of rain, and of a future that was, for the first time, not a terrifying unknown, but a shared and hopeful promise. It was like the rain that had saved them, a miracle that arrived just when it was needed most. He drew back slowly. Lila opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. The last of the sunlight was in his eyes, turning the weary gray to a soft, warm gold. "It's my first time," she whispered, the familiar words now imbued with their final, true meaning. "The first time I've ever chosen to stay." Colt Harrow still did not speak. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the home she had been searching for her entire life. He reached for a thick wool blanket that was folded on a nearby bench, a survivor of the fire. He gently, carefully, draped it over her shoulders, the rough fabric a comforting weight. Then he sat down not opposite her, but beside her, their shoulders almost touching. Together, they watched the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, its fading light painting the clouds in shades of rose and deep violet. They looked out over the blackened land, toward the distant spot in the arroyo where a single, stubborn stone sat, washed clean by the rain. The stone where a man had carved his family's initial, a simple H, the place where the water line and the telegraph line and their own two unlikely lifelines had finally, miraculously, intertwined. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow listeners. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help us share these stories with a wider audience.